Chris Mackowski for the American Battlefield Trust. It is the 10th of May, 2023, which means it is the 160th anniversary of the death of Stonewall Jackson. Jackson died at the small plantation office building that's behind me, today known as the Stonewall Jackson Death Site. Some of you may be familiar with it as the Stonewall Jackson Shrine. But this moment's really going to kind of culminate our Chancellorsville 160th coverage. We've got Sarah K. Bierle behind the camera. She's going to be coming in front of the camera to share some of her observations about this moment in time. Some call it the great turning point of the war. Some people don't. I'm one of those folks who thinks it's important on a personal level, but maybe not at the big sweeping war-changing level that others do. And I'm saying that with all sincerity in my heart as a Stonewall Jackson fanboy. He's on my hat today as I'm here to talk a little bit about this story. Of course, to recap, if you look at some of our previous videos, you'll see that we walked the mountain road outside the Chancellorsville Visitor Center where Jackson and his staff were engaged in a friendly fire incident on the evening of May 2nd, 1863, excuse me. He's evacuated from the battlefield, taken to a field hospital where today you can still see the remains of the Wilderness Tavern. There's a brewery and a winery in that area. You can go there and kind of be on the ground where that amputation took place as May 2nd creeped into May 3rd. He's going to lose half of his blood as a result of his wounding and his amputation. And as a result, the trauma of that injury is going to hide the fact that he's been sick. If you were with us as we traced Jackson's flank march, we talked about his illness, how he was sleeping on the ground and he was complaining of shivers, how he was wearing every article of clothing that he owned as his men were making the march in temperatures that reached into the mid-80s. He didn't have time for heat stroke. He had to push his men onward. But that illness that was plaguing him before he was wounded is hidden by the trauma of the wounding and his amputation. And so prognosis actually looks good from that amputation. What they want to do is bring him down here to the Confederate railhead at Guinea Station. The actual train station was off to my right along the train tracks that you can still see today. They follow the historical train bed that was here once upon a time. This is where Confederates could bring their supplies, their ammunition, their reinforcements, but they couldn't bring them closer because they would fall under the guns of the Union Army up closer toward Fredericksburg. Here's also where they're going to load wounded people and send them down to Richmond where they can recover well away from the battle. So that's the plan for Jackson. Get them here, get them on a train, send them to Richmond. Except that the train tracks are torn up. George Stoneman, the Union cavalry commander, has gone in a wide sweeping range to try to cut Lee off from his supply route. His raid is generally ineffective, but he does manage to sever that train line long enough to prevent Jackson from going south. So instead, he's going to come here to the Fairfield plantation owned by the Chandler family, and they're going to invite him into their house where he can recover there while they're making the train repairs. Except that the main house is already being used as a hospital. And so they're going to then, Jackson's staff is going to commandeer this small little plantation office building where he can have some peace and quiet, away from the hustle and bustle of everything else that's going on around here. So they're going to take him in there. He'll never set foot on the floorboards, although I invite you to visit when the building is open, because the sound of history as it creaks under your feet as you walk those planks is absolutely incredible, evocative of the story that took place there 160 years ago. So Jackson's down here, prognosis looks good. He's going to spend time talking with his staff saying, gosh, God has a plan for me. He was a highly religious man, and so he thought that this wounding was just part of God's plan, and he couldn't wait to see what was going to happen next. He's talking with his staff. Everyone thinks everything's going to be fine. So in this time, Robert E. Lee, back in Chancellorsville, is trying to figure out what to do next. And to talk a little bit about that, I'm going to invite Sarah to come on camera and share her thoughts about the post-period of Jackson's wounding. We're going to do a little magic switcheroo here, so be patient.
Thank you, Chris. And one of the things that I've been thinking about and doing some more research on this year, as we are in the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Chancellorsville and the 160th anniversary of Jackson's passing, is what effect did it have that Jackson lived beyond his wounding. Jackson was in bad physical condition the night of his wounding. As Chris pointed out, we think he's lost about half his blood. And, we read the records that survive, and we don't want to try to diagnose from 160 years later, but we can look at what the doctors, what other eyewitnesses said about Jackson's physical condition, and we can draw the conclusions. It was bad. He was in a bad case of shock. He's lost a lot of blood. He's in pain. He then has this amputation. He's not in good physical condition. So one of the things that I've been wondering is, what if Jackson had died on May 2nd, 1862, or the night of May 3rd? What if he hadn't lived the 8 days longer? And I started looking at this first from a military side. Does Jackson do anything significant that impacts the rest of the Battle of Chancellorsville or impacts Lee's thinking in those 8 days between Jackson's wounding and Jackson's death? And militarily, something really unique happens. And I think there's a good illustration of this that comes from the early morning hours of May 3rd, 1863. So Jackson has been wounded at that point. He's endured his amputation. He's come out of the effects of chloroform. He's supposed to be resting. He's got a few staff officers watching over him. Dr. Hunter McGuire is there, medical director of the 2nd Corps, and one of Jackson's staff officers arrives. Alexander Swift Pendleton, probably better known as Sandy Pendleton. He often acted as Jackson's chief of staff, although he does not officially hold that title or capacity with Jackson, but he does the work of that type of staff officer. And Pendleton arrives, and he insists to Dr. McGuire that he must see Jackson, that it is vital for how the rest of the Battle of Chancellorsville will unfold. And reluctantly, McGuire grants permission. Pendleton goes in, and he's trying to talk to Jackson. He's telling him that Stuart is going to be taking over command of Jackson's Corps, the Confederate 2nd Corps, and he's asking, do you have any orders? Do you have any information that I can pass along to Jeb Stuart as he's stepping into command infantry? And the accounts say that Jackson seems to think about it. His eyes kind of light up a little bit as if he has something that he's going to say, and then he says, no, we're gonna have to, tell Stuart to do what he thinks is best. And Jackson kind of begins to resign a little bit there. Certainly he's been under great physical and mental strain. He's probably still in a lot of pain from his wounding and operation, but it's interesting, and it's one of those moments where Jackson is starting to let go of military command, not because he necessarily thinks he's going to die. As Chris has pointed out, he sees his wounding as something providential. He wants to know what might be in store for him in God's plan, and he thinks he's going to make a full recovery, and he could probably even come back and command his corps again. He's just lost an arm. So those are interesting things to consider. But for the Battle of Chancellorsville, Jackson isn't providing further direction. There are accounts of him kind of providing commentary on what he thinks should have happened, or, oh, that was very good, or, the Stonewall Brigade has kind of done it again. He provides commentary. There's a little bit of correspondence that passes between Jackson and Robert E. Lee, but that's more illustrative of their working relationship together, not as much of this is what I think you should do, those sorts of things. So I feel, looking at the primary sources we have, the records of what Jackson was saying, what he was thinking and telling those around him, he's not influencing military matters once he is wounded. He's kind of removed from that. And perhaps it is to his credit that he realizes, I can't be an active command. I can't micromanage the rest of this battle from my hospital bed. And he really does let go, and he's going to let the next commander make those decisions. So if Jackson isn't heavily influencing the military scenario for these 8 days that he lives between his wounding and his death, why do the 8 days matter? Because I think they matter because there's more to the picture than just the military story. If Jackson had died on the night of May 2nd or 3rd, he would not have been able to do two important things that were very important to him. He would not have seen his wife and baby daughter again. So they are able to travel from Richmond once the rail lines are open. Their arrival is delayed because of the damage to the railroad that Chris has mentioned from Stoneman's raid. But eventually Mariana Jackson and their baby daughter Julia do arrive, and he gets to see those two people that are very important to him in his final days. And another thing that was really important to Jackson, and he talks about this or writes about this at other times in his life, and also during his time here at the Chandler office building at Guinea Station, Jackson wanted his good death to happen in a certain way. And good death is a concept that is evolving and in practice in the 19th century, that you die professing your faith, you die surrounded by your family, you die prepared to go into eternity and meet God. And for Jackson, that was really important. He wanted to have time to prepare for that. He tells that to his wife as he's nearing the end of his life, and he is allowed to have that. So if Jackson had been killed instantaneously on the battlefield in the night of May 2nd, or if he had died in the ambulance ride to the field hospital, he would not have, one, seen his family, and two, really had that opportunity to think about eternity, to think about his future beyond death that he had often hoped to have. Now, if you've been looking at the background behind me, behind Chris, the shot that we've set up here for you, you are seeing the white building, which is the Chandler office building, known as the Jackson Death Site now. But also, over here, we've got a granite pillar marker monument, and sometimes people arrive and they think, oh, that's where Jackson's buried. It's not. Jackson, spoiler alert, is buried in Lexington, Virginia, one of his, kind of the town that he adopts as his hometown, where he lived about 10 years prior to the American Civil War. So this marker, it says Stonewall Jackson died May 10th, 1863. And it says right below it, buried in Lexington, Virginia. So this is one of those moments of read the entire inscription, and it may give you some answers. But this is one of the markers that one of Jackson's staff officers goes around the central Virginia area after the war and puts up. So they're the James Power Smith markers. We've seen them at other locations in our Chancellorsville 160 coverage. And you can find them on the various battlefields in the area. So this is one that Smith puts up. Smith, again, one of Jackson's staff officers, he's actually here when Jackson passes and helps to look after Jackson's widow in the days after. So if you're exploring the area, you can find one of the numbered James Power Smith markers in the area. So one of 10 in the vicinity.
Thanks, Sarah. Quick little story about the monument. When my daughter was young, and we'd spend a lot of time down here, and we actually saw someone come up once on the anniversary, and they got down and they kissed the monument. And my daughter, being, like 8 or 9 at the time, she says, "Ew, did they know that dogs pee on that?" So in their over-reverence, perhaps hygiene wasn't on the forethought. And I share stories like that because it is something that, people tend to get over-reverent sometimes when you talk about Jackson, because he is the great martyr of the Confederacy. There is a lot of mythology that surrounds him. And I like to remind people, he was just like you and me. He was a human being of flesh and bone. And when Sarah talked about the story of him being able to be a husband, being able to be a dad for that final few days of his life, to me, that's one of the most compelling parts of his whole story, because it reminds us that he was a dad, that he was a husband, that he wasn't just this great mythical hero. He was a family person. And I find that particularly poignant because of my own relationship with my own daughter, surrounded by this story of Stonewall Jackson. As we walk across the property here, we'll recount the arrival of Mariana, who comes up on the train on the 7th of May after the train tracks have been repaired. By that point, doctors have realized that Jackson's condition has suddenly taken a turn for the worse overnight. He's clammy, he's white, his breathing has become more difficult, But he wouldn't let his staff officers wake the doctors up because the doctors have been working tirelessly for days. Hunter Holmes McGuire, Jackson's surgeon, has been hovering for days without sleep, and finally, on the night of the 6th, went off to get some sleep. And so Jackson says, no, don't wake him up. When McGuire comes in the morning of the 7th, he's aghast at how terrible Jackson looks. He sends to Richmond for some additional assistance. They're going to send in experts up on the train. Governor Letcher is going to come up on the train, and Jackson's wife is going to come up on the train. She's going to bring with them their 6-month-old daughter, Julia. And when Mariana first gets off the train, they won't let her into the house because the doctors have to do their examination. And then she's looking around, she's aghast. Over in the area off to my left, there were several temporary graves, and they're disinterring bodies. And at first she thinks maybe it's actually her husband, and she sees it as a terrible omen. One of those bodies they're disinterring is actually Frank Paxton, their friend from back in Lexington, who was commander of the Stonewall Brigade, and he was killed leading his men forward on the 3rd of May. So she's really shaken up by that. So then they offer to let her go in the main house and have her keep busy, make some lemonade. And so she tries to do that, really kind of fretting about what's going on here. And finally, she sends lemonade into the house. And after the doctors finish their examination, Jackson takes a sip of the lemonade. And he's like, oh, this is too sweet. The only one who makes it this sweet is my Esposita. And that's when he realizes she's there. And she comes into the room and she sees how terrible he looks. He just looks horrific. And it's such a shock to her because she'd been with him just several days before, prior to the start of the campaign. And he was in the peak of his manly vigor at the time. And now to come back and see that he's just wasted away, it's a shock. And he tells her, we must not wear a long face in the sick room. And he tries to comfort her, telling her that things will get better. God has a plan. Things will be all right. And she asks if she should bring Julia into the room so that he can see her. And at first he says no, because he doesn't want his infant daughter to see him in such a state. But again, confident that things will get better, he says there'll be time for her to come in. And so Mariana will try to offer comfort, and she'll stay by her husband's bedside over the course of the next few days as doctors come in and out trying to do what they can to alleviate Jackson's condition. They try a technique that today seems awfully medieval called cupping, where they take hot globes of glass and they put it on the chest to create blisters. And the idea was that it would draw out the fluid from the lungs when you would lance those blisters, and that would suck out the fluid out of your lungs. Of course, we know that's not how that works. Probably the worst thing that they do to him is they have him stay in bed. He's propped up, and treatment for pneumonia was bed rest. We know today that you got to get up, you got to move around, you got to keep the fluid in your lungs pumping out, circulating out. But instead, he's going to lay there, and it's just going to fill up his lungs, and then he's going to start to get exhausted. It's going to be hard to breathe, and so exhaustion will set in, making things even more difficult. And so that's how these next few days are going to pass. Mariana, at one point, on the 9th of May, offers to sing or pray the Psalms with him. And Jackson is so exhausted that he says no. And then he catches himself and he says, well, no, we must always give glory to God if we have the opportunity, and they will pray. One of his favorites was the 43rd Psalm. Show pity, O Lord, and please forgive. May let poor repentant rebel live. Are not thy mercies wide and free? May not a sinner trust in thee? Great words of hope and optimism in this time of darkness. As we come over here to the side of the building, we can see this is the room where Jackson's going to spend his last few days. Now, because of COVID and security issues as a result, they've removed the 3 original artifacts that have been in that room. The bed that Jackson spent his last few days in, a blanket that was used to cover him up, and a clock that sat on the fireplace mantel that's going to tick away his last few days. On a good day, you can come down here to the Jackson Death Site, walk into that room, hear the sound of that ticking clock, and it will transport you back 160 years. Another sound you're going to be able to hear loud and clear in just a second is the train as it comes down from Washington to the north, headed toward Richmond in the south. That's why this plantation office building was located here. That's why Guinea Station was here. All part of the train system that's going to service things. I'm not going to try to yell over this train as it gets a little closer because that'll ruin our ambiance. Hark. You can take a look over here. fine melody of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad, indeed. And as we were standing here waiting for the train to pass, one of my superpowers came in. I found a 4-leaf clover right here outside the window of Jackson's office space, so a little bit of luck for us today. Finally, on the morning of Sunday, May 10th, doctors realized that Jackson's not going to be able to survive the day. His condition has deteriorated so poorly that they bring Mariana in and they break the news to her. The man to do that is her family physician, Samuel Morrison, her cousin, their hometown physician from back in Lexington. And he offers to go and tell Jackson that his condition is dire, but Mariana wants to be the one to do it, and so she'll go in and sit by his bedside. She'll explain to him that today would be the day that he will meet their Savior in all his glory. And they talk for a little minute, and it's as though Jackson at first maybe can't hear her or can't understand her, and he's struggling to wrap his mind around it. And finally he closes his eyes and he says, good, that is good. I've always desired to die on a Sunday. He asks to have Julia brought into him, and he'll put his bandaged hand over her head and he'll pray over her and call her my little comforter. And it's a very poignant moment. And I always think about that little girl growing up, not knowing who her father is other than the stories of the great Stonewall Jackson. And here's their last final moment together as he commends her and her spirit to God, even as he and his own spirit are getting ready to meet them. He'll start fading in and out of delirium as the day goes on, start fading in and out of consciousness. He'll start shouting out battle orders. Send in A.P. Hill. Tell Major Hawks. Get Major Hawks. And he'll stop. His whole body will relax. And eventually this smile comes over his face that Dr. McGuire describes as a smile of ineffable sweetness. Although McGuire himself so moved by the impending death of his friend that he leaves the room. He's not there in those final moments and has to share those observations from the few family and staff members who are able to remain. Very calmly, very gently, Jackson looks at them and he says, let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees. And then he dies. 3:15, Sunday, May 10th, 1863. A lot of people ponder the loss of Jackson and what it means for Robert E. Lee. And some people will go so far as to say it's a turning point of the war. Indeed, Robert E. Lee will never again score a major offensive battlefield victory after Chancellorsville. So to talk a little bit more about the impact of Jackson's death and the repercussions it has on those around him, I'm going to ask Sarah to come back on and share her thoughts.
Thank you, Chris. As Chris Mackowski was just pointing out, people interpret Jackson's death in different ways. Some people see it as a turning point for the Army of Northern Virginia, a turning point for the Confederacy itself. I tend to lean toward thinking that Jackson is one of those thousands of casualties that come from the Battle of Chancellorsville that is going to impact Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia and their ability to take battlefield offensive. Certainly, Jackson's death creates a leadership challenge for Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. And it's also going to create a moment of change for everyone that Jackson impacts, whether it's the common soldier in the field who knows him very distantly, who may have complained about him, who may have cursed him on long marches. It's also going to impact those staff officers who worked with him daily, who knew him well. Of course, it's going to impact his wife, Mariana, who's now a widow, their daughter, Julia, who's going to grow up and never remember her father, or never remember him in life. There's lots of memory around Jackson that Julia will be involved with. So one of the things that has become very poignant to me coming here to the Jackson Death Site is to see it both as the place where Jackson ended his life, but also as a place where everyone else around him had to find a way to kind of go on. I'd like to walk around to the porch here as we kind of contemplate this idea. Jackson's death as we've been talking about, it's going to change people's reactions. It's going to change how they're seeing the war. It's going to change their motivations. One of his staff officers that I mentioned earlier, Sandy Pendleton, he will tell Mariana, "I would have died for him." Pendleton is going to spend the rest of his life trying to be the man that Jackson believed that he was, the leader that Jackson wanted him to be. 27-year-old Dr. Hunter McGuire is going to be forever impacted by Jackson's death. What happens here at Guinea Station is going to influence how he continues to practice medicine, how he views the Confederacy after the end of the war. One of the things I always like to do coming here to this death site is to just spend a moment here on the porch and looking at the door. And this is the door that Jackson is carried in, wounded, ill, although they don't know how ill yet. On his stretcher, he's carried in, and then after May 10th, after he dies, he's going to be carried out of this building. And then think of all the people still living who know Jackson, who've loved Jackson, who fought with Jackson, worked alongside him, lived with him. They're going to pass through this door as well.
And Sarah's absolutely right to think about the people coming in and out of this door. And I hope you are one of the people that will come in and out of this door, even though this door is 160 years old. People ask me all the time, what else is there to say about the Civil War? What else is there to say about Chancellorsville or Jackson? Well, I think the most important thing is for you to come and experience these places for yourself so that you can have a deeper sense of meaning and resonance with these stories for yourself. Walking in the footsteps of history allows us to connect in poignant ways that give us surprising insights and give us deep emotional experiences. That's why battlefield preservation is so important, so that we can walk these grounds and be in these places and study and learn and experience and come to our own conclusions. You've probably heard a lot about the impact of Stonewall Jackson. We've offered you a couple thoughts to think about. I'm sure people in the comments below are making all sorts of comments. And, I think about the former British Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, who said, here's where the Confederacy died. But beyond all that, I want you to go beyond what you think you know and read more and study more and look at opinions that might be in opposition to what you think you know. Read primary sources, read the analysis of the experts, walk in the ground yourself, and come to your own conclusions, because I think you'll find the story much more meaningful that way. We've got plenty of coverage for you to go back and review here for our Chancellorsville 160th. Just tons and tons of content on our YouTube page, on our Facebook page. Please be sure you subscribe. Be sure that you like. Pass the word on to your friends. Do what you can to support battlefield preservation so that we can come out and keep sharing these stories with you so that you can experience them for yourself. For Sarah K. Bierle behind the camera, I'm Chris Mackowski for the American Battlefield Trust. Thank you for everything you do to support battlefield preservation and education.